Let's move this thing out of the way. I think I only need one in right now, because I'm not going to do the music thing today. Just leave it off. Too bright. The weird thing about the lighting in this room is that like I have to be in a very specific position in order for like the camera not to, like, for me not to look all weird on camera. I mean, not more than I already do, right? So just updating stuff here on YouTube and just posting my link. So just getting this thing started. Okay. Okay, fine. YouTube wants to be weird. I don't know why the thing doesn't update on the YouTube playback, but that's not particularly relevant. OBS is working fine, so we're just gonna go with that. I like want to put on background music, but the problem is that like YouTube is way more strict on like what you can play and what you can't play in the background. So I don't want to run into any trouble with that. So I'm just gonna leave it like this. I know it's kind of like super quiet, but oh well. I guess that's how we're gonna be doing things. Unless someone wants to make me like a mixtape or something, but even then, right? Like the only way it would really work is if like someone gave me all original, like they did it themselves, you know, music, and then they just gave that to me to use. But that probably isn't gonna happen because that takes a lot of work, and I'd have to pay you to do that. Which I mean, sure, I have a day job, but I don't know if I want to be spending extra money right now after I spend a lot on this computer. But anyway, um, that's not too important. Um, Instead, we're just gonna dive right into the reading since I don't have any music buffer to like play while I wait for people. But that's okay. Besides, you can probably hear me better anyway. Of course, the only drawback is background noise you might hear as well. For instance, like the room I'm in is next to like the stairway of the house. So people walking up and down the stairs, and you'll obviously hear it. But I suppose it can't be helped. Anyway, hello and welcome to the stream Parson Reads Genesis, and I'm going to be continuing where I was last week. So last week, well, it's been a week already, when I last read Genesis, I read from chapter 1 to chapter 3. And now I'm going to read from like chapter 4 on to like I don't know. I'm thinking like maybe up to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is like half of Noah's trip on the ark. Because the problem is if I read the entire Noah thing, that's like 5 chapters. And so we'll see how long it takes me to do that. So we'll see. Um, but I'm gonna start with chapter 4, which actually has a lot of content in it. So, but I don't want to just do like one chapter, right? Because then we'd be doing these things forever. Not like that's entirely a bad thing, but at the same time, on these streams, I do want to read multiple books and go through the Bible. And if I had started in January, I would have tried to like do a Bible in 1 year thing, but um, that's all right. We could just work with what we got now, right? So anyway, I'm going to start from Genesis chapter 4. I'll be reading from the New International Version, or NIV. If you want to follow along, I'm just going to start with a quick word of prayer, and then we're going to just dive right into the word. Lord God, I just thank you for this day, and I thank you for the time that we can be here and just read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would reveal yourself to us, and we would encounter you. I just pray in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right, so Genesis chapter 4. Oh, I guess I should do a quick recap so chapter 4 makes a little bit more sense. So chapters 1 to 3 of Genesis. I mean, it's basically the creation story in a nutshell. God made stuff. He made Adam and Eve, and then they lived in the Garden of Eden, and then Adam and Eve committed sin, and then God had to kick them out of the garden. So basically, everything changed for the trajectory of which God had designed humans for. So basically, God was like, okay, I made this nice place, the universe, and I want human beings to live in it and kind of, live blissfully and just kind of have a place where God can dwell with people. And so, that was a big plan, right? But of course, the big plan didn't go as straightforward as God would have liked, because human beings have to go screw stuff up as we do. Which then jumps to chapter 4, where I'll mention a fair amount of hot takes, if you will, because I think the Cain and Abel story is a lot more interesting than talking about Adam and Eve and the introduction of sin to the world. I don't think there's really a lot to delve deep into when you're reading into that story. Whereas Cain and Abel, there's way more to read into, which I will definitely do. But of course, I'm going to read to you the Cain and Abel story first. So this is Genesis 4, starting from verse 1. So the man, Adam, made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to God. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions of some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great. It is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mahujael. No, that can't be right. Mahujael? See, it's one of those things where, like, okay, so the name is spelled Mehujael. Now, for us English speakers, we would say Mahujael. But I'm pretty sure, since we're reading an old story, I don't think the J is actually pronounced like a J. I think it's pronounced like an H. So I think it's actually pronounced Mahujael. And Mahujael was the father of Methuselah. And Methuselah was the father of Lamech. Now Lamech married 2 women. One was named Ada, and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who lived in tents and raised livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. Some real parenting naming skills right there. Just name 2 kids, basically the same name. You just change one vowel in the name. Nice one. And Jubal was the father of those who played string instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze. And from Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Now, Lamech said to his wives, "Ada, Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Now Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another son in the place of Abel, since Cain had killed him. Seth also had a son, and his name was Enosh. And at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord." Okay, so that's chapter 4. Chapter 4, there's a lot in here, particularly with the relationship with Cain and Abel. And I think the Cain and Abel story, despite it being pretty short, is actually really interesting. Now, I know I have some hot takes when it comes to the Cain and Abel story. And I don't know why they're hot takes. They're they're factually accurate and they make sense logically. But you know, you always have people who, I don't know, just think it's a hot take. Maybe I assume it's out of biblical lazy or literary laziness, honestly, more than like trying to be doctrinally accurate. Um, because the reason why, you know, and I'll give my hot takes in a moment, but I think when you, well, I guess I should give them first, and then I'll explain why it's more important to read the Cain and Abel story this way. So the first thing I'm going to say about the Cain and Abel story, and I know it's a bit of a hot take, is that I think the way the Bible tells it, Cain and Abel are actually the first two real human beings. Now, when I say when they're the first two real human beings, what I mean is that Cain and Abel are what we would constitute as actual people. Like people that you and I could be like, oh yeah, that's what a person is like. So first of all, um, let's go back to Adam and Eve, right? The objection would be, well, Adam and Eve are the first two human beings. Well, sure, they're the first human beings, but they're not the first two real people. And what I mean by that is, see, Adam and Eve were like, there's magical elements to them that distance them from, you know, us as human beings, right? Despite the fact that yes, we're all born from Adam and Eve, that's true. But at the same time, um, I think there's a little bit of distance between Adam and Eve and then the rest of humankind. So the first is that, you know, Adam and Eve are created, right? They're not born. And I think that's a very interesting thing to look at because Cain and Abel are, well, we could argue that there may have been siblings in between Cain and Abel, not particularly important. Um, but with Adam and Eve, they were created, right? They're not born like human beings are born. So in a way, that's already something that distances Adam and Eve from what we would constitute as real human beings, right? So that's number one. That's the first thing I want to point out. And two, not only were they created, they lived in paradise. You know, they lived in magic land, basically, in the land of Eden, which is not what we would constitute as normal human beings. Now, with that being said, I think when we look at Cain and Abel, they are, you know, it's easy to see how they're the first two real human beings because, you know, they're born and they live in the regular world, quote unquote, right? Because, I mean, yeah, sure. Um, it tells you that, like, you know, Cain moved to a land named Nod, which was east of Eden. But then, like, what does that even matter anymore, right? Because no one can even go there. So, because remember, there's a whole, like, cherubim with the flaming sword and all, so, you know, going to Eden, good luck. But basically, you know, everyone after Adam and Eve was barred out of Magic Land. So Cain and Abel are, you know, they live in the real world, and they live in, you know, they live as human beings. They don't have a life before, you know, what we would constitute as the real world, right? And so, because Adam and Eve did. Adam and Eve did exist in this, you know, the land before time kind of thing, right? Whereas Cain and Abel exists in, you know, sure, it's the ancient world, but it's still the real world as we would know it. It's just not developed yet. But for the most part, Cain and Abel live in the real world as real human beings. And so I think it's interesting to look at that because it says a lot about the human condition when we look at it through characters like Cain and Abel, as opposed to simply looking more at Adam and Eve. Because I think the problem when you try to analyze the human condition through Adam and Eve, then because Adam and Eve are magical, or, you know, somewhat more magical than, you know, what we would view as magical and more human today, I think Adam and Eve are somewhat excluded from the dialogue of how we can understand the human condition. But I think Cain and Abel, being the first two real human beings in a lot of ways, I mean, obviously there are other, Adam and Eve could have other kids. That's true. That's obviously true. Um, Heck, Cain and Abel don't have to be the oldest, right? So in a way, they don't. They're. I mean, they may not be the first two real human beings in that regard, but that's besides the point. But um, I think through Cain and Abel's story, we understand a lot more about the human condition, and I think that's something that we can read into this story. And I think it's really important for people to know this story. So I remember I was watching this one guy's video, and he was doing like some basic trivia, and he was going around. I can't remember who this guy was, um, and he was asking like questions of like, where's India on the world map, and other kind of like, they should be really easy questions to answer, right? And one of the questions he would ask was, who are Cain and Abel? And nobody knew the answer to that question. I mean, people didn't know where India was on the world map, and it's apparently there are a lot of people who don't, which is kind of scary because the boomer in me remembers that like I learned where India was at a young age because Dalsum lives there, from Street Fighter, and then of course Street Fighter 2. I know there's a sidetrack trivia, but Street Fighter 2, I think it's the first game, at least I ever played, that displays the world map, a real world map. And so when it shows all the fighters and their locations, and it even like announces like their country. So like when you go fight E Honda, it goes like Japan, right? And then when you fight Dawson, it goes India. So like you can look at the map in Street Fighter 2 and you can know where India is. So it's kind of worrisome that people don't know where India is. And I think the video was made in like 2018, but that's besides the point. Basically in the 21st century, right? Um, but back to what I was talking about. A lot of people don't know who Cain and Abel are, which is a real shame. Even if you're not a Christian, right? I would say that like, well, reading the Bible is still important regardless, because of course, one, you can understand a lot of literature in general, especially Western literature in general, because I mean everybody makes some kind of reference to it. But of course, I think when it comes to the Cain and Abel story, there's so much philosophy that could be understood through understanding the Cain and Abel story. Um, which I will talk a fair amount, and I feel like the next 20 minutes to like half an hour, if you humor me, I'll be talking about the Cain and Abel story and talk about all these philosophical implications of it. But it is one of those scary things where if people don't really, if you don't know who Cain and Abel are, I think you cheat yourself a lot of understanding the human condition and why people are the way they are. So, with that being said, um, I'm going to delve more into verse by verse of the Cain and Abel story. And you'll kind of see, I'll play out, talk about some important philosophical talking points. And you can really see a lot of that within the Cain and Abel story. So I already talked about the first part about how Cain and Abel are the first two real human beings. And I think that's really important because that allows for, analyzing human beings. And especially with Cain and Abel being the earliest human beings, you can really see into like something that is so rooted in human beings that regardless of the time frame we live in, there are certain things we could know about the human condition because it happened as early as Cain and Abel and it continues on to this day. And I think that's a very important thing to understand. And I think that's why it's so important to know the Cain and Abel story. Anyway, so verse by verse. So, verse 1, not particularly relevant. Eve just says, she gives birth to a son and says, with the Lord's help, I have brought forth a man. So, to my knowledge, Cain's name is a play on words, which means like in the Hebrew language, it would have been something like the word you use for like acquiring something, that you obtained something. And so, of course, Eve naming him that, and of course, with chapter 3 as context, you know, there's the whole thing about childbearing was going to be painful and all that stuff, right? And the whole punishment for the eating off the fruit. Um, and then, of course, Eve is grateful that, like, I have this son. And so I think uh, there's this gratefulness in that Eve implies in Cain's name. And so the best way to like kind of see the meaning of Cain's name is like, you know, a gratefulness for something that you have, right? To be grateful for what you have. And you'll see why this is important, why I bring this up. So continuing on verse 2, we get the whole thing with Cain's brother, Abel. Now, Abel's name has a very opposite meaning to Cain's, which makes you beg. I mean, I understand where some people have objections to like whether any story is true because the names are too perfect, right? Especially when you like look at like Cain and Abel, right? Their names are too perfect, like of what they mean and the symbolism in it, right? So Cain's name is like being grateful for what you have, and then you have Abel, whose name means like vanity, right? Which vanity is a very loaded word, right? It means like um, to strive for nothing, basically, is what vanity is. That's the best way of me of defining it. To break that down, I guess a way you could understand the word vanity is like the person who works hard their whole lives, but then like nothing ever goes right because every time they do something right, something else would just go terribly wrong for them, right? And then that builds like a nihilistic attitude, right? Because what's the point? And that's kind of like what vanity is, right? You strive so high, but basically you obtain nothing, and so um, that feeling of emptiness because of that's vanity. And so that's Abel's name, which is funny because then knowing that, there's a good reason why a lot of kids don't name, or a lot of people don't name their kids Abel, because it's actually a pretty bad thing to name your kid. Because honestly, who wants to name their kid Vanity? I know I'm aware that like there's a whole joke that strippers use it ironically, and it's weird that I bring that up. But you with that being said, right? Uh, you gotta if you read into like texts that use names like that, you gotta give credit to these writers where they knew how to be funny at times. And I am saying the same thing about the book of Genesis, that obviously there was some humor given here, right? Like, who names their kids like Earnesty and Vanity? Like, who does that? It's almost like, if you another pop culture reference like The Lion King, right? Like, you name one kid Mufasa and you name the other kid Scar. Like, what do you think is gonna happen? So, it's kind of the same thing with like Cain and Abel, right? You name these two brothers with opposite names. What do you think is gonna happen? And so, when you look at the Cain and Abel story within the first two verses, you're supposed to kind of figure that like something's up in this story, right? Something's up because no one just starts a story with naming two people that have completely opposite names. But of course, as we read later in verse 2, here comes the irony. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to God. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, But on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. And this is what makes the story so great, because the Genesis is written with like this immediate inversion in this story, right? So verse 1 and 2, we get the whole like Eve had two boys and they have opposite names. Especially when one guy's name is like gratefulness and earnesty, and the other one is like vanity. But of course, the Bible immediately uses these names ironically, and that's shown in Cain and Abel's offerings. So to go a little slowly on this one, because the whole like, if you don't know who Cain and Abel are in the story, of course you're gonna ask, well, why did you know God not accept Cain or whatever? And there's a lot of answers to this, to the many questions that are addressed in this story, which I will address as many, a few of them anyway. So the thing that needs to be pointed out is that this story does something very interesting as well. And I might as well kind of point it out here, where because Cain and Abel, as I made the hot take earlier, are the first two real human beings, in an interesting way, at least from how I read the Bible, and take this with a grain of salt, because some people may argue that God may have done this a little bit earlier, like in chapter 3, and even chapter 2. Chapter 1, you can't really make an argument about this, but in chapter 4, I think this is the first time we also see God behave more like a person. And this is where I kind of also make that distancing between like Adam and Eve and the first two human beings, because the way God interacts with them is not quite as what we would constitute as human, um, as opposed to how he reacts with at least Cain anyway, um, and Abel to an extent. Because now I know this is kind of the reason why this is a hot take is because the idea of like, well, um, when I say God acts human, it's easy for people to associate that like, well, but God doesn't have sin, so how can he act human? But of course, in my last video, I talked about how like sin is just us distorting, how to act like God and claiming that we're God, right? That's the real sin, not so much that the humanity within us is sin in itself, because that doesn't make a lot of sense. Because then why would God give us humanity, right? Um, that would make God evil, and that would that constitutes as blasphemy. So um, I think it's more like God has what we would constitute as a lot of human elements, because in a way he had a perfect image of humanity, which is part of humans being made in God's image. Um, I mean, obviously, the whole built in God's image thing is very loaded and is an endless spring of trying to understand what the hell that means. But part of that, I think, has a lot to do with how, in a way, God has these very human like characteristics. But that's not because, you know, God is not, all loving or all that stuff like we think he is. But in actuality, human beings are more like God than we think we are. Well, I mean, that's not necessarily, no, maybe not that last part might not be true, right? Because there's probably a lot of people who think they're more God than they think they are, than they really are. But at the same time, what I like to believe is that God shares in our humanity to show us that, we can be brought closer to God despite the fact that we are only people, right? And it's not the fact that we're people that bars us from God, it's the fact that we have sin in our lives that blocks us from God. And so, obviously, one of the big problems, especially as a modern thinker, we tend to think that those two things are closely associated, right? Humanity and sin. But this may not necessarily be true. And, um, the person of Jesus in the Christian worldview is that, well, yes, sin and humanity are not the same thing, because Jesus became a human being and did not sin. So obviously, there's a way to be human without sin, right? Of course, none of us can do it on our own, right? Because I think the big problem is, once again, um, it's the fact that God is divinely human in the person of Jesus Christ versus, um, humanity in itself that overcomes sin, right? So there's that paradox there too, and I know that's not a satisfactory um, explanation for some people. They say like, well, why would I, why does it have to just be Jesus, right? Why can't it be, you know, whatever I think it is? And I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question. But at the same time, I what I'm trying to get at though is that being human in itself is not the sin, right? And so because of that, for God to behave in a quote unquote human way is not, you know, distancing God from his nature, that he's good, or, that he's loving or whatever, right? That God having human elements does not deny him of him being God, right? Having human characteristics doesn't make God less God, if you will. And I think that's important to think about because, of course, I think one of the other reasons why a lot of people reject the Bible is because the Bible actually does do that a lot. It really makes God way more human than people think he is. And this is where the Cain and Abel story is pretty important because, coming back to the Cain and Abel story, I think the Cain and Abel story is the first place where we really see a lot more of God acting in a human way. And I'm going to put out a particular part of the human um, way of living, if you will, and that is the fact that human beings can be arbitrary, right? That um, we do things because of our autonomy, right? And because we have autonomy, we can think and do things that have nothing to do. They can have nothing to do with anything and can even be contradictions, right? That's kind of the nature of people, right? We think many contradictory things at the same time. And so, because human beings do this, and then of course God acts human in some parts, in a lot of parts of the Bible actually, um, which ironically, where people complain that, well, God has contradictions in his character, is like, well, but so do all human beings because we all possess that arbitrary element. In an ironic way, it is not. It would not be a problem to view God as having infinitely more contradictions than human beings because, unlike human beings, God doesn't have a limit to that either, right? In his arbitrary nature, because he's God and is not limited, he can have as many arbitrary natures as he wants to, really. Whereas human beings, eventually, you know, we decide that, okay, there's only so much being random that I can take, right? We all have a random limit. It's a for some of us it's a pretty high limit. Um, but just because you have a high randomness limit doesn't mean that the limit doesn't exist. But of course, the problematic part, and I can understand the argument where people would be, you know, have problems with God, if you will, and that's with the whole, God has no limit to how arbitrary he can behave, and that can, and the Bible tells us that can be very frustrating at times. Um, and the first instance of this is right here in the Cain and Abel story, right? God does something very arbitrary, and it it can come off as very, well, not nice. Let's just go with that. So with that being said, I'm going to talk more about the whole sacrifice thing, right? With Cain and Abel and the sacrifice, right? Because obviously this sacrifice that takes place is kind of what drives the narrative, right? So in this sacrifice, Cain sacrifices some like fruits and vegetables, I assume. And Abel, if you don't understand the euphemisms being used, basically he kills a cow, or sorry, he kills a lamb, and he offers like the fattest part of it, right? Um, the good stuff, if you will. If you were, if you eat lamb, and there's obviously some parts that are better than other parts, and lamb fat is pretty amazing. Um, and so that's the part that Abel offers to God. Now, not even on a theological level, which I will get to later, the theological level. Basically, what I mean by that is, the answer every major Christian pastor will tell you why God accepts Abel's offering over Cain's. Which, I mean, there is a theological answer, and it's likely the right answer. But even if you disregard that for a moment, you could easily see why, from a human perspective, um, why Abel's offering would be accepted, right? Because imagine if someone was giving you something, right? And so the way you're supposed to view these offerings is that like one has, like, sure, let's talk about Cain's offering, right? It's fruits and vegetables, always useful, right? Fruits and vegetables are good for you, right? And it's always useful, right? Having crops is always useful. If someone gave you crops, you'd be like, you still be grateful about it, right? You're like, yeah, awesome, right? But the big difference here is that like with the lamb, with the choice part of the lamb, it it it's more than just what is expected, right? And it's kind of considered a high grade offering. So if someone just gave you some fruits and veggies, you'd be grateful. But if someone gave you like really good meat, like a choice part, it doesn't have to be a lamb. Let's talk about like a choice steak, right? The steak part, the sirloin, right? If someone gave you like a sirloin part of a cow, right? You'd be a lot. Well, okay, I know maybe some of you are vegetarians. You'd be, you think all meat is gross, but you know, the ancient world wasn't like that, right? Vegetarianism was not a thing in the ancient world because nobody could survive, because of course, um, people had to eat meat in the ancient world for the proteins, right? You needed the proteins. Protein supplements did not exist back then, so everybody had to eat meat. But but uh, imagine if like someone gave you like the sirloin of a steak, right? Like you would find that to be a better gift, even if like yeah, fruits and veggies are always useful and it's always good. You're not gonna complain if you get fruits and vegetables, right? But someone gives you a choice that a choice steak sirloin, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, right? You're gonna get excited about it, and that's a possibility of how God could have been arbitrary about this. Like, that, the choice lamb is obviously better, right? It's obviously better. Um, Now, moving into not so much of just like everyday human things, I want to move into something of like Middle Eastern mythology and how people would have understood, these kind of stories with Cain and Abel's story, right? And I'm not quite in that theological level yet, but obviously in the more higher level narrative, when you read any of these kind of narratives and the way you should understand these narratives and why, you know, things are the way they are in stories. So when you read the story, there's a lot of implications that are given in these short amount of text, right? Because the Cain and Abel story, I read through it pretty quickly. What the Cain and Abel story is like. Uh, Before we get to like basically 16 verses, and then of course from verse 17 to the end of chapter 4, just talks more about Cain, right, and his life after, um, you know, moving away from his parents. So when the story only tells you about the offering, you also have to look at the bigger context of the world building of the story, right? And so while the offering is a single act, there's actually a bigger story of these people being played, right? So I talked about it earlier with the whole naming conventions, right? Of Cain's name being like meaning earnesty or gratefulness, and Abel's name meaning like vanity. But the big twist of the story is that, what are their jobs, right? Now, it tells you that Cain worked on the ground and Abel was a herder of sheep. And so you have to understand the culture of, the Middle Eastern world and how they would have ritualized these kind of things. So Cain's job, being a farmer, and of course, I'm not downplaying farmers, but especially more so in the ancient world, not so much nowadays, because of course, modern technology has changed a lot of things, and that's wonderful because when in the ancient world when everybody had to be a farmer, the world actually kind of really sucked back then because even though like tons like the majority of people were like farmers, hunters, and gatherers, people still live from like hand to mouth, basically, which is not a great way to live. It doesn't leave you a lot of room to do a bunch of other things, right? If you're constantly living hand to mouth. But the way that this, if you understand like Middle Eastern mythology, farmers are like the Joe Blows, right? Like nobody cares about them. Um, they're just kind of the side characters, right? They're nobody important. And so this is interesting when you look at Cain's status in the story, right? Because Cain is the older brother, and it's even fair to assume he is the firstborn of Adam and Eve. I mean, there's no reason not to think that, because if there was an older brother, they would have put him in the story, right? Um, but whatever. Um, but of course, Cain's name kind of suggests is that he could be the firstborn because of the whole like thanking God that she even got a kid, um, basically, uh, as she implies in verse 1. So Cain, even though he has his name kind of symbolizes that he's supposed to be this like, genuinely nice guy. He's a good guy. He's someone who's grateful for life and all that. But he's also just a nobody, right? Cain is a nobody, ironically, in the story. Whereas Abel, the guy whose name is like vanity, that life is basically meaningless, he's the one who's the heroic character. And the reason why I say he's a heroic character is because of his job, right? That he's a shepherd. And the Bible, not just the Bible, but if you read other well, it's not just Middle Eastern mythologies. Even Indian mythologies use this too. With like ranchers, people that are like carers of animals, right? Um, whether they're shepherds or ranchers or something like that. They tend to be viewed as heroic characters because you have to protect livestock from predators, right? So because you have to protect livestock from predator, it makes you, you know, you're not just some guy. You're a person who's out there kicking ass, basically. Um, predator. You got to ward off predators. So you're a fighter. You're you're someone who puts their life on the line. You know, for what? Livestock, right? But of course, the Middle Eastern culture and the ancient world culture as well was that, you know, without this, well, civilization would not exist, right? So, in a way, you're also a protector of civilization. Of course, farming obviously does some of that too, right? But I mean, before agriculture, people were the Neolithic era, as we call it. People just like hunted and gathered everything. There wasn't like agriculture as we know it today, and not remotely close to agriculture like today. Um, thank God for modern technology. We've gone leaps and bounds ahead. But like, um, with the shepherd and the ranchers or whatever, right? They're kind of viewed as these heroic characters because they mean in a way because they can protect animals and keep animals for human use, if you will. Um, it it greatly allowed civilization to flourish. And so being a protector of that progression of history makes you look awesome, basically, is an easy way of putting it. And so I think that's an interesting thing to point out with the Cain and Abel story, right? So Cain being the older brother, ends up being the nobody in the story, right? Whereas Abel, the younger brother, with really nothing going for him, with a name like Abel, he's the one who's like loved by the people, right? Because he's a protector of civilization. And so this is interesting to look at when you understand the story this way. It really makes a lot more sense of why, you know, sure, it makes God seem less arbitrary than I kind of pointed out before, that God could have been very arbitrary in the way he picked the sacrifices. But when you look at the story this way, then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, it makes sense. You'd pick the guy who's more awesome, right? The guy who does something the guy who does something, the guy who, you know, puts his life on the line, right? Like, yeah, I'm gonna accept your offering. Like, you're clearly the more awesome dude, right? Um, which is one way you could look at Abel in comparison to Cain. Finally, I'm gonna just give you the theological answer, which is super boring after I just gave the whole like, shepherds being like civilization badasses. But the theological answer, and if you want that definitive answer of why did God choose Abel's offering over Cain's offering, the simple answer is that because it's a blood price, right? Because Abel had to kill an animal to do it. Now, I mentioned this last week when I talked in Genesis 3 about how God had to um, do the first sacrifice, the first blood sacrifice necessary, right, for Adam and Eve's sin. And it's implied that God kills two animals at the end of chapter 3 when it says that God made clothing out of skins for Adam and Eve. So, how do you get those skins, right? And the answer is probably that he killed two animals, to clothe them. So in a way, he sacrificed two animals for them. Now there's the physical aspect, right? Like, okay, they're naked. How are you gonna put clothes on them, right? And when Adam and Eve tried the whole like putting fig leaves on themselves, it wasn't gonna cover for that long, right? So you needed something a little more permanent, and animal skins do the job fine, right? So um, the animal skins were used, and God had to use animal skins to clothe Adam and Eve. So he had to kill something to do it, right? Um, and so in that passage, what I was getting at as well was that because sin existed in the world, the need for blood sacrifices became a thing, right? Because as many times in the Bible mention, because of sin's existence, people gotta die, right? But of course, a sacrifice system was made so that something else could die in humans' places. But of course, there's a flaw in that system, right? Because there's the whole like stuff made in their own image and humans being made in the image of God, which is understood that humans have more value than animals. So, you try to make a monetary equivalency of like, how many sheep does it take to sacrifice in order to clear the sins of one person, right? um, and I'm sure many people have tried to figure that out. But, and that's why the whole sacrifice system pre-Jesus was, a complicated thing, right? Because they tried to basically figure that out. To no avail, mind you. But I mean, people tried, right? But and points for trying. But since we are talking pre-Jesus time, I won't be using that cheater answer, right? That of course, the Christian message is that Jesus was the only sacrifice needed, right? Um, because God gave His own life in the person of Jesus, but which has an infinite value, right? So it can pay for all people's sins, right? That's kind of the logic behind that. And a big reason why in Christianity it's an important piece of doctrine, if you will, in Christianity is that we believe Jesus is God, because if he's not, then his sacrifice cannot apply to everybody making Christianity essentially moot. So there's your little logic puzzle there of why Christians make a big deal about the divine nature of Jesus, right? Because if Jesus wasn't divine, then technically he cannot sacrifice for anyone. So, well, maybe one person, but like he couldn't. Jesus's sacrifice could not apply to everybody, and therefore would make Christianity moot. But anyway, that's its own thing altogether. Going back to Cain and Abel, and the whole God accepts the dead lamb is because it's that kind of sacrifice, right? That someone had, something has to die for me. Now, of course, you can get into like the literal sense of like, well, I had to kill all those pesky vermins, to protect my crops. So technically, more animals died for my crops. But I mean, that's not exactly how the sacrifice system works, right? You can't sacrifice pest. That's not sacrifice material, right? That's like if you're to sacrifice like a rat to God, like that's like the lowest of low grades. Like another book in the Bible even makes jokes about that. Like, are you shitting me? Basically, God is saying, are you shitting me? Like, you would not give your earthly master, basically your employer, you wouldn't give him like roadkill to eat for dinner. Why are you offering me roadkill? Like, um, that's in the book of Malachi. If you want to read that up, that's my paraphrase of Malachi. Um, Basically, God gets mad that people are offering him roadkill, and God's like, seriously, what the crap, right? um, but the as far as Cain and Abel's sacrifice, he sacrifices a lamb, right? So there's the whole like, well, that's one reason why Jesus adopts that name, right? That Jesus is the lamb, right? Given for the sins of the world. And so the lamb, of course, is another symbolic creature of like, it's innocent, right? A lamb is a pretty non-malignant animal. It doesn't go around being a dick like Canadian geese or something. And it's not a predator either, right? So it doesn't go around killing other animals. A sheep is a pretty passive animal. Of course, the problem with sheep is that they're also pretty stupid. So sheep require protection all the time, right? So if you can offer something that took a lot of your work to do, and you had to go out of your way to sacrifice a lamb, that makes God appreciate you a lot more. I think that's kind of the idea behind it. Right? That's the main idea behind why a lamb versus, another kind of animal. Okay. I'm moving a lot slower than I thought I was. That took me a lot longer to explain, and we're only on verse 5. Okay, verse 6. So verse 6 is a great verse. At least if you're a glutton for punishment, like yours truly or something. But chapter 4, verse 6 actually says a lot of, the human condition, if you will. And of course, this is it. It's kind of ironic because we learn something very interesting about God in this verse. So I'm going to read it for you again. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now, this is actually a very interesting passage. And obviously we have to remove some like, understanding things through the New Testament and all that stuff. And really look at what's being established when, the writer of Genesis was giving this to, the early Israelites and, early Hebrew people. And it's, as I call it, I'm going to call it the arbitrary nature of God. And this is kind of what we really see that for the first time in this passage, where basically when God is saying to Cain, like, you know, why are you mad, right? Well, just do better, right? Which, which, mind you, is the last thing Cain wants to hear, right? Because the last thing, like, and this makes sense to anyone, right? If you're not, you do something, but you're not good enough, right? You know, I'll use another example that I'm sure will hit home for a lot of people, especially guys my age that are probably still single. But let's say you ask a girl out and it doesn't go very well, right? The last thing you want to hear when that happens is what did what could you have done better? What could you have done to make it work better, right? That's the last thing you want to hear. Because the thing most guys want to hear when they go through rejection is like, well, that girl's a bitch, right? That's what they want to hear. That's what a guy wants to hear, right? When they're rejected by a girl, they want to hear something like, well, she's a bitch. You can do, you don't need someone like that, right? Which is not what God does, right? With Cain, he doesn't say something like, oh, um, I know I can be a little hard on you, or something like that. He doesn't hear anything like that, or I like your brother better. Well, actually, that would be pretty bad too to hear that. But anything is better than God saying, "Do better." Why don't you think about what you did wrong, right? You're obviously the one who's not doing something right. Because it's so easy, and this is one of the things with as modern people, and this is a big danger, is that we're so easy to turn things on God and say, well, God isn't nice enough, or God doesn't answer my prayers because he's not nice enough, or God doesn't accept me because he's, maybe he's not all loving, or people think that, well, things are going bad in this world because God doesn't care, right? Or something like that. You've probably heard all those and objections of why people, and many my Christian viewers, you've probably heard this from like a lot of your non-Christian friends of why they think your religion is stupid, right? And why they think you're stupid because you believe in God, right? Is they think like, oh, how can you believe in someone who's not that nice or whatever, right? Because more often than not, we as human beings like to try and turn the tables and try and point it at God, that it's God's problem, right? It's God's problem that the world isn't good. It's God's problem that there's hunger. It's God's problem why there's poverty. It's God's problem why there's racism, right? It's God's problem, right? And that's the thing we like to hear, and that's the thing that, that's what we want to hear. But the Cain and Abel story establishes it pretty quickly that when there is stuff wrong in this world, more often than not, it is our fault more than God's, if anything, right? Because God basically takes no responsibility, because he's saying, well, it's not my problem, right? And this is where the last part, and this part used to always be strange to read, partly because, when you read the New Testament before the Old Testament, this part kind of feels like it makes no sense. But it's a part when God tells Cain, if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it, right? Of course, you don't hear that from modern Christians saying like, well, you can overcome your sin. You must rule over your sin. We don't tend to say that kind of thing, right? Because, it's easier to say that, well, Jesus can forgive you, and that is true. But you got to think about what God is saying about the human condition, right? That a lot of things that are wrong in this world fall onto us, and yes, it is a big part is our responsibility, to deal with it. Of course, God will forgive us when we fail, but it is still your responsibility. You have to own up to it, right? And I mean, that's when people talk about repentance, right? That it's implied in that too, right? Because when Christians say, well, we have to repent of our sin, the implication is that you have to own up to it, right? That you have to say, well, it is my fault, right? That I do these things, right? As opposed to saying, well, God, it's because I was, it's because I was born in a poor community, God. So actually, it's your fault that I'm a thief because I was born in a poor community. Or, well, God, uh, I molest children because you make every adult woman a total bitch. It's your fault, right? So younger girls, I have to go for teenage girls because adult women are bitches because you made them that way, right? Like, when you hear me say this out loud, but it sounds ridiculous, right? But this is the rationale that a lot of people have, and this kind of anger toward God, and some of it is justified, but at the same time, you can't say like, well, because it's God's fault, then I can do all these bad things, right? And you can't just pin it on Him, because when you take that agency away from yourself, then one, there's no motivation to change, right? There's no motivation for you to try and be a good person. I mean, even if you're not even if you don't believe in God, right? There, if you don't own up to the fact that you do bad things, what's the point of trying to change, right? Why would you bother trying to be a good person, whatever religion you have, if you don't believe that you have to own up to anything you do? That is just, the transcendence fault. It's God's fault that all these things are wrong, right? But in this story, God is basically saying like, no, I'm not taking the none of this responsibility is mine, right? Anything that you want to do right in your life, a lot of it you're gonna have to do that on your own, right? And you have to own up to the fact that you might not be as hot as you think you are, right? But at the same time, you know, God allows us for growth, right? And Christians' fancy word is the sanctification, which is what that word actually means, right? Um, that through the power of Jesus, we can actually do better. Because in Christianity, we still believe that we have to do works because, well, God requires it. Just because we're forgiven of sin through Jesus doesn't eliminate that we have to, still do what is right and still do better. Of course, the Christian worldview is that we are also empowered to do so because of Jesus, right? Jesus gives us the power to do that. Whereas before, when we try to do it on our own, we will always fall short. But of course, that's not entirely a bad thing on its own, right? It's okay to just accept that, yeah, we're not as great as we are, but the problem is when you start blaming God for all your problems, right? Because that's the evil, right? That Cain has fallen into. Now I know that's now with all that being said, I know that's like a really hot take, and I'm pretty sure some other theologian's gonna like roast the shit out of me for that. But this is what if you read closely in the Cain and Abel story, I think it's a very important thing for us to understand that you know God doesn't take any responsibility for our sin, right? And it's foolish of us to think that like, yeah, it's God's fault, so I can justify me doing all these awful things because it's actually God's fault, right? Which when you say it out loud does make you sound really stupid. And I used a few really bad examples because the best examples are the bad examples. But think about anything in your own life, right? That any time something doesn't go right? The sacrifices you make go unnoticed and even get rejected, right? But instead of looking at it's someone else's fault, right? The thing that's important is to look inside yourself, right? And be more introspective, which is obviously something Cain lacks. And that's unfortunately, it's not just Cain that lacks this, right? It's a it's a big part of the human conflict, if you will, that we lack introspection, and not so much because we don't have the ability, but rather we refuse to do it because if you're forced to be introspective, then you will see the bad things in your own life. Excuse me. Um, you will see the bad things in your own life, and most people don't want to be confronted with that because it is ugly, right? Why lie about it? But but at the same time, it's a major danger to blame God, right? I mean, that's worse, right? Um, which is what you know God is trying to tell us through His arbitrary nature, right? And so the arbitrary part is where God basically says, like, not my problem that you're not good enough, which once again is the last thing somebody wants to hear, right? And using the rejected by multiple girls illustration again, you know, if you get rejected by a girl and then you try to pin it on her, and she says something like, "Well, that's not my fault. It's not my fault. I don't like you," right? um, maybe you're a shitty human being or something, and that's why I don't like you, right? That's the last thing a guy wants to hear. But that might be more often the case, right? Because it's not someone else's fault that things don't go right for you all the time, and that's not always true, right? Obviously, there are factors outside of you, but at the same time, there are a lot of it has to do with you, right? Because you know, nice guy syndrome. You see all those nice guys, and they're like, well, then she goes date some douchebag, right? So maybe it has something to do with you, right? At that point, because if she's willing to date a different douchebag other than you, then obviously it's you, right? So some food for thought and hot take right there. And so in the same way, uh, God is kind of taking that approach, right? He's saying, well, it's not my problem, right? You got to fix it yourself, right? The last thing I want to say about that little exchange between God and Cain is that, like, it says a lot, going back to the whole, what does this story tell us about the human condition, right? Is that there is going to be that whole, like, a lot of stuff is going to be kind of random in your life. And it is so easy to just try and not find the fault in it within yourself, right? And one of the biggest dangers is when we try to scapegoat all our problems, right? Whether it's because of someone else's class or someone else's gender or whatever, right? That is the reason why we have problems in life. It's a very dangerous way of thinking because it, in a way, this justifies dehumanizing other people, right? When you blame others, that's also it's extremely dangerous because it also dehumanizes others, right? Because then when you're saying, well, that person is less than human, right? That's why they're not nice to me, or that person is less than human, which is why you know they they force me to be a thief or whatever, right? Though it's their fault, right? So I'll tell you a funny story. Well, it might be funny for you, but it wasn't funny for me. But my day job, I know I'm not, for professional reasons, I won't say too much about it. I'll just give a general description. But as a security guard, which is what I do, not allowed to say anything about the company or anything, but I can say that much. I can say that I was a security guard. And being a security guard is not fun, all right? I know it's a thing probably security companies don't want you saying, but let's be real. Um, like real talk, right? Like you don't have to ask a security guard if they love being a security guard. You don't have to ask them that. You know a lot of them are not happy because every day they have to deal with asshats who like one try to break the law like right in front of you basically. And then they pin everything on you. It's always your fault as a security guard, right? It's always your fault that, you know, some person who's homeless doesn't get food. It's your fault, right? It's your fault that I'm homeless. It's your fault that, I do drugs and that it makes me poor. It's your fault that, um, you know, violent crimes happen. It's your fault, right? It's always your fault. And, security guard, as a security, you get so tired of hearing that shit from people, right? Especially like, okay, so, you got to kick a guy out of a store because he's trying to steal, right? And you're like, hey, get the hell out of here. You can't be, you know, theft is a crime, dude, right? You don't want me to call the police on you. And it's always like, why can't you just let me have it, right? Don't you have compassion, right? But of course, it's because of people like you I have to steal, right? Why can't I just steal? Which, when people say that out loud, it sounds ridiculous. But, and I use theft as an example because, one, I see it a lot in my job, obviously. But, and, when you hear me say it like that out loud, it sounds ridiculous, right? That people try to justify theft like that, right? It's like, oh, but I need it. I need it more than you do. I need it more than these people need to make like $2 off a cheeseburger or something. I need the cheeseburger more than you need the $2 that you charge for it, right? That make stealing okay, right? That's kind of the. But then of course as a security guard is like, no, that's ridiculous. You can't be stealing anything, right? Um, and so then people get all mad about it, saying, well, it's your fault that you know I'm angry. It's like, how is it my fault that you're angry, right? How is it my fault? Or the best one I love hearing this one is like, well, why don't you try being homeless, and then you can see why I need to steal. It's like, no, right? What kind of absurd logic is that, right? But people have tried it. I've heard that one before. That's a good one. You try being homeless, and then you know then you see that what I do is not so bad. It's like, no, that has nothing to do with anything, right? Um, but anyway, uh, the other one too is that like, well, I used to do a security job at like this one store, right? And it was all Chinese people working at the store, and I too am a Chinese person, and of course the race card always gets played, right? Your racist chinks, you know, so greedy, right? Always trying to make all this money. You have no compassion, whatever, right? Why can't you just let me steal this? It's like, are you out of your mind? Right? Like, no, that's not how things work, right? You can't just go and steal stuff. Theft is a crime, right? But it's always someone else's fault, right? And as a security guard, you always hear it's like someone else's fault. It's never the guy who's trying to steal's fault, right? It's never their fault, right? Um, it's never a thief's fault they have to steal, right? That's kind of the logic they use, but it's like, no, that's not how the world works. I mean, you don't have to be a religious person for that to make sense, right? But then again, I have been proven many a wrong about that one. So what do I know, right? But uh, that going back to the Cain and Abel story and what this has to do with the human condition is that one of the biggest barriers of you know a person believing in Jesus, in God in general, I guess you could say. Because I'm going to blanket statement and kind of applies to other religions as well, why people don't believe in religion or are very not committed, if you will, right? Because some people may say like, well, I'm a Buddhist or something, but like they're not practicing, right? They're just kind of labeled um, because their parents are Buddhist or something, right? Because it applies to I see a lot of uh, people that come from Buddhist families also do this too, right? But they don't view as like, how do I put this? They don't view like, see, in Buddhism we call it the pillars. In Christianity we call it like, you know, the truth of the word, if you will, or whatever, right? The main thing of your religion. Um, People don't view it as binding, right? And I say binding in the sense of like, because I identify as like, okay, for example, because I am a Christian, right? I view the Bible as binding, as in like it matters in my life, in my daily life, in all aspects of my life, right? The Bible and what it says matters, right? Um, but when it comes to things like certain ethical issues, a lot of people tend not to view their religious views as binding, right? And that doesn't really matter in their regards to ethics, right? And that's where the hypocrisy comes in, and it's why a lot of people are opposed to religion. So it's kind of ironic, huh? But but at the same time, with the human condition, on the one hand, we don't like being bound, right? Because you hear the word like binding and you think like it limits me, right? The whole like idea of rules are meant to be broken because suck the fun out of life or whatever, right? Which is a dangerous way of thinking, because then if people have no rules, then chaos, takes over, and then you just get mayhem and no one has fun. So um, it's a two-way street in that regard. Um, but at the same time, the two sides of it is that like the human condition, we hate being bound, but at the same time we have to accept it. But on the other hand, from God's side is like, well, you better take this as binding and you better own up to it and try and live up, because I'm not taking responsibility. If you suck at it, you suck at it. That's your problem, not mine. Which is why a lot of people also are object to God sometimes, right? Because God's not going to say, well, okay, it was my fault, my bad on it, right? Because more often than not, God never does that. So, uh, I've said enough about that. I know that was I. The reason why I have to delve deep in this hot take is because it bothers me a lot that a lot of Christians don't take this seriously, right? This aspect of understanding repentance in this way, and that you know because God has this somewhat arbitrary nature of, well, it's not my problem, and God acts a little bit ambivalent because of his arbitrary nature, which is his whole like not my problem. um, and a lot of Christians, they tend not to view that as seriously as they should sometimes, and I think that's where we run into a lot of problems when um, dealing with repentance, right? Because I think one of the reasons why repentance is not as preached as often in churches is because we we don't just level out that like we have to own up to stuff that we do, right? I mean, it sounds easy on paper. It sounds obvious, right? That we got to own up to what we do, and in a sad way, fellow Christians, in a sad way, a lot of the secular world actually understands this better than we do sometimes, right? That we got to own up to what we do. Of course, there's also a lot of part of the world that, well, more of the world than not, obviously doesn't want to do that, because if you have to own up to things you're doing wrong, then that's the implication that there are things that are wrong, and then you have to try and find truth, and truth is truth is always ugly, right? Truth is never pretty. Um, and I think that's something that, especially in the Christian world, we've done a massive disservice, right? Especially to the image of God, in that we only try to pretty up what truth is for people, but more often than not, it can we can tend to twist it and not make truth at all when we try to make it too pretty, right? So, um, and ultimate, and the Bible talks about this multiple times, where it's like, what's more important, right? The truth, or telling people what they want to hear? And so, I mean, we like here, God maybe is acting in his all truthfulness, where he's just like, well, you being you being not very good at what you do, Cain, is not my fault. That's just the truth, right? You're not as cool as you think you are. You're not as good as you think you are. Which is an ugly truth that we all have to accept. Anyway, I have talked way too much about that, but once again, I know you had to bear with me for like almost an hour on this hot take, but it's a very important one, and I feel like it is something that needs to be talked about a lot more. And then, I mean, it's not Cain and Abel's story is not the only place this happens. Throughout the Bible, there's lots of instances that God kind of talks like this with people. But I think the interesting thing about the Cain and Abel story is that this is the first time we see it, right? And in a funny way, it's because of the Cain and Abel story, you're supposed to go like, okay, so God does this from time to time. As opposed to like hip-hopping different parts of the Bible and you see it and you act like it's the first time he's done it. But no, this is like in Cain and Abel's story he does it, and it's kind of like, get used to this because God does this a lot. And yeah, I know some people don't like it, but it's his demand for justice, right? It's his demand for truth, that you're going to hear things you're not going to like. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out in the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So yeah, verse 8 tells you everything about how that conversation went down. God tells him, not my problem that you're a loser. And so Cain decides to go kill his brother of all things, right? Because, I mean, in a way, part of it is that Abel is the representation of everything Cain cannot be, right? Because Cain is a nobody, but Abel is like, this great heroic character, right? And, for the most part, not just anyone can become a heroic character. Not just anyone can be, the big cheese, right? And so Abel became everything that Cain hated in himself, right? That Cain is so inadequate or whatever, right? And so Cain's solution to this is simply to kill that image, right? Of the good stuff in life, right? The thing Cain wants to be, the hero of the people. So there's that. Not much else to say about that. But basically, when Cain takes it out on someone else, right? It shows that Cain is not willing to be introspective. That he doesn't listen to God and say, hey, look inside yourself and see what's up, right? Don't look at things outside of yourself and try and view them as the problem. Now, this part of the story is super interesting as well. And the Cain and Abel story in general is very interesting when it comes to understanding real human beings. Now, I started the hot take with like talk about how Cain and Abel are the first two real human beings, and the story is like, the story kind of implies that, right? Because of the whole like they're the first two that are born, right? Eve gave birth to them, so because they're the first two born, that's how we understand that human beings come into the world, right? Because all of us are born for the most part. Some of us had to be C-section, which technically, according to Shakespeare, can be a workaround being born of woman if you were C-sectioned out. Points to you if you know the reference to that. But when it comes to Cain and Abel being first two human beings, you think that as the first two real human beings, maybe they could get their act together. Maybe humanity could go off to a great start. Maybe humanity could go down and do amazing things. No, the first two human beings end up in conflict and one kills the other one, right? And so, what does that say about the human condition? What it says about the human condition is that, you know, all human beings, we are born from Adam and Eve. And we are unfortunately kind of destined to fight, to be in conflict, right? At least if we are left to our own devices, right? Of course, in the Christian worldview, this is why we need God, right? This is why we need Jesus, who can move us away from that, right? Who can save us from that horror of the human condition, that we are fated to fight one another, we are fated to hurt and kill one another. It is part of who we are, right? Which is an ugly thing to. This is a really ugly thing to think about, right? That is what, you know, binds all human beings. That's something that has always been a part of human beings that are born, is that we are born to fight one another. And the Cain and Abel story, you know, one way to look at it is, you know, the first two real human beings couldn't get their act together, right? Because, you know, even though Abel is kind of the heroic character, he's not all that perfect either, right? Because he does nothing to help his brother, at least not to our knowledge. And so, in a way, you know, human beings, we tend to think that, well, if I only do what I have to do, right, then everything will go fine, which is not true either, right? Because eventually, someone else, you know, you don't live in this world by yourself. So eventually, someone else is going to come and hurt you, right? And, you know, that's a ugly thing to deal with. And it seems almost hopeless for humanity, right? Like, is this what human beings will amount to? It's just nonstop fighting, um, nonstop conflict and hatred towards each other. And, you know, this kind of, the Cain and Abel story paints, you know, the need of a savior, right? That human beings must be saved. Because obviously, you know, if the first two human beings couldn't get it figured out. So you think anyone else is going to get this figured out? That, like, you know, for us to move away from violent tendencies, for us to move away from hatred, it's not going to happen on our own. And that's kind of what the Bible is painting here with this story, right? That this is the human condition. It's an ugly thing where we fight one another and that we will cause pain to one another. And so, in a way, if you read the Cain and Abel story and understand that, and you look at the world today, it should not be a surprise to you why, you know, there are wars and conflicts like that. Why is there racism? Why is there, you know, all these other discriminations and hatred towards each other? Is because I know it sounds super gloomy, but we as human beings, that's what we live for, in a way, right? We live to hate other people. And, you know, stuff like racism or whatever are just like the excuses we come up with, right? Because they're not really reasons. They're really excuses for us to hate other people, right? Which I know it sounds super gloomy, and it's not the thing a pastor should be saying. But at the same time, when you understand the Cain and Abel story this way, it's the reason why we need a savior, right? It's the reason why, you know, we need God, you know, to change our lives. Because, you know, on our own, we as human beings just hate people. It's just what we do. But what's going on here? Oh, sorry, my phone just went all weird on me and it turned on my voice activation. Sorry. I got like, and then my phone started talking to me, right? Because it thought I wanted something, but weird. But anyway, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so I think it's one of those things that I view the story and see that, yes, this is exactly why we need a savior, right? This is why, you know, like, we need to put our trust in God, right? And this kind of, going in the grand context of Genesis, right? And as I talked about last week, and I'll keep bringing this up, you know, for the Israelites and the Hebrews moving into the land of Canaan, right? Canaan is a crazy ass place, and by extension, you could say the world is a crazy ass place. And because it's such a crazy ass place where people hate each other, because why not? Um, people are pretty awful in this world, because why not? We need to trust God that He can protect us and restore us when we are like that too, right? Which is essentially the message about sin, right? That's how we understand what sin is that, like, you know, sure, it's easy to look at other people and say, well, you're bad, but we're all kind of like that, right? We all hate people for no reason at times, and we all have to repent of that. But at the same time, you know, the Bible is very honest that it's deeply rooted in the human condition, um, because of, well, we live in a sinful world, right? And this is understandably why, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people have a hard time separating humanity and sin at times, because yes, deeply rooted in the human condition, there's this place of malevolence, I guess you could say, where we just hate people for the sake of hating them, right? And it's not a pretty place to be in, but at the same time, it is something we must face, right? But the sad reality is that you're not going to do very well facing it on your own, right? Because you might just blame God or something else, and not, instead of like looking of how you must change, right? But the gospel message is all about how Jesus can free us from that, right? And you know Jesus is willing to take your hatred, and He took that hatred you have for others to the cross with Him, right? So that you don't have to hate people anymore. You don't have to be a person caught up in the malevolence anymore, right? You don't have to be that anymore, because Jesus took that on the cross, right? That's what it means for Him to take your sin, right? That's one reason of it. That's one way of understanding that, right? Or that's one part of it, right? There's obviously more to it than that, but I'm only talking about that one part because it relates to the Cain and Abel story. Um, but I mean, from the Cain and Abel story, we see that that whole thing branches out, right? I mean, that's why so much evil exists in the world, is because we like it, and that is not a good thing. That's something God cannot stand, right? Is that we like being bad, um, and not in the cool, like, oh, it's so bad, right? Um, Not that kind of bad, like bad, right? But anyway, um, to sum up the Cain and Abel story, because now we're moving on to like just Cain. Um, and wow, I'm barely making it through one chapter. I thought I'd do way better than this. But uh, the reason to understand the Cain and Abel story, even if you're not a Christian, and you know anyone, understanding the philosophy, the human condition, which every piece of literature tries to address, right? And reading it in the Cain and Abel story, and you see that, like, because inside of all of us is this darkness that we cannot overcome on our own, right? And we see it as early as the earliest human beings, right? Especially Cain, who is arguably the first human being, right? Because he's the older brother, right? He's implied to be the eldest brother. He's the first real human being. And of course, I'm just focusing on him now because, in a way, Cain is the more, ironically, and the irony goes back and forth, where before Cain was a nobody, but at the same time, you know, he's the most interesting character because, I mean, the story is about him, right? And the story is about the first human being, and the first human being commits murder, right? Which is why murder is viewed as one of the biggest evils in the Bible, right? Because taking someone's life is the worst thing you can do, right? So, and the first human being does it, right? And kind of just chooses to do it because he feels like it's the best way of doing things, right? The best way of doing things in the first human being's mind is to murder someone else, the most evil thing you can do to someone. So that is some food for thought, and I think is another reason why it's so important to understand, you know, the Cain and Abel story, right? Is because of the dangerous mindset that potentially can exist in all of us, right? Because it exists in the first human being, and there's no reason it couldn't exist. There's no reason why it couldn't exist in any of us, right? If a thought like that easily came to the first human being, it could come to any of us just as easily. Which is, as I would say, all the more reason we need Jesus in our lives. All the more reason we need a savior, because if left to our own devices, just like Cain, it would be easy, so easy, right? Just to commit evil like that. Because, you know, it's God's fault, not mine, right? That could be the rationale we just used. Which is a very dangerous place to be in. Which is probably why Cain felt like he was able to just do that to Abel, right? Because he's just like, well, it's God's fault anyways. So, which is, you know, you could argue is the biggest douchebag move, right? Just blame someone else as you go commit murder. Which, mind you, you know, if you've read any murder cases, that's usually the intention of murder when they give their motivation. It's their fault, right? Victim blaming. Yeah, victim blaming. Well, we all know how far that'll get you in life. But just going to finish here because it's almost like 5 o'clock for me. And I will be joining another person's stream. I think he likes to start earlier, especially when he's not working today, so we'll see. But anyway, moving on. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied, am I my brother's keeper? The implication of that is, yes, you are. The Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you're under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened his mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. So God's straight up like, yeah, you did something horribly evil, and now you have to suffer the consequences. Now, this is an interesting thing that I know some people where, once again, we're kind of going to poke at the arbitrary nature of God. Because, I mean, it's there, so you might as well poke at it, right? So, in a lot of the laws, especially when you read in, like, the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and there's a lot of talk about how, like, if someone commits let's say someone commits murder in a community, then that's technically punishable by death. Well, it is punishable by death, right? As modern people, we've kind of changed that a little bit. We don't immediately do that, right? But technically, if you murdered somebody, you get stoned, right? You're punished by death. But in the Genesis story, some people may view this as a contradiction. God does not immediately kill Cain for this crime, right? Because technically, Cain committed a crime and he should be punished accordingly, right? And if murder is supposedly met with the death penalty, people then say, well, how come God didn't just kill Cain? And I think the interesting thing that God does here in this story, and part of his arbitrary nature, if you will, is that God basically tells him, you live with what you did. Right? Which in a way is kind of worse, right? Because then people constantly shame you and whatever because you're a bad guy, right? As opposed to if you're dead, then that's it, right? As far as the accusations are concerned. But basically, God tells him, you live with what you did, right? And, the funny thing is that Cain kind of wants the death penalty, if you read it, right? Because he's like, uh, verse 13, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I'm a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So Cain is basically wishing for the death penalty, right? But God's like, no, you live with what you did, and I'm going to make sure you do by making sure nobody can kill you, right? Can rob you of your punishment. And that's why he says the whole thing of like, if someone kills you, I'll punish them 7 times, right? Because he's basically like, no, you live with what you did, right? Which is a hard thing to deal with, right? Because accepting the consequences of your actions is not a pretty thing. And of course, the thing with Cain, once again, talk about the human condition, right? That it goes, Cain has not learned anything from his whole thing with his brother, right? Why was Cain so upset with his brother, right? Why don't you look inside yourself and see what's wrong, right? That's what God is basically telling Cain. Why don't you look inside yourself and see what's wrong, right? And even here, when Cain's like, oh, whatever, I'll leave here and I'll die, right? You've already given me the worst punishment. What's the point of living? But God's like, no, you live with what you did, because you better learn something, right? Which one a lot, like, gives out room for repentance, if you will, which is something that the Christian message is all about, repentance, right? And then so there's that element which is given to Cain. And of course the other thing too is that, like, speaking from a philosophical perspective and the philosophical side of things, instead of trying to blame God for things going wrong in life, figure it out, right? That's what God is telling him. He's telling him, like, figure it out, right? Don't just blame me for all your problems, right? If you just try to scapegoat all the time, you're not going to get anywhere in life, right? And so God is telling Cain, like, maybe there's an opportunity for you to look inside yourself, right? And God gives him that opportunity. Now, I know, going back to the whole quote-unquote contradiction, where according to the law, if a guy commits murder, then he gets the death penalty. Of course, the issue with reading the law books and not the narrative aspect is that the law book tried to be practical, right? Because you can't have these murderers just running around, right? So, especially in a society, right? Because, in the Cain and Abel story, there's not much of a society yet, right? It's implied that Cain actually starts the first real society, which I guess makes sense, right? The first real human being builds the first real society. So there's another point in Cain's favor that he's the first real human being as opposed to his dad. So, um, weird. Um, but the whole, like, when God was harsh on the punishments in the laws was because it was meant for the betterment of a society, not necessarily for an individual. Which, yeah, there are some problems when you, like, try to meld the two together with, like, what's good for the collective versus, like, what's good for the individual, right? Because in the Cain and Abel story, and God telling Cain, look inside yourself, right? That's a more individualistic story, right? It's telling Cain to look inside himself as an individual, and then find God within the individuality. Whereas the laws, which talk about, like, stoning a murderer, is more for the collective, and it is in the collective's interest, to stone a murderer, if you will. Whereas, like, we have the whole joke about, like, why sex offender files are given out, right? It's for the collective, right? So you got to protect the community if you're going to let a known sex offender live in that community, right? This guy is a known sex offender. We should notify the community. And the reason why we have to publicly say this is so that the community is safe and they can be safe, right? Because they know. That's kind of the idea, right? So there's the collective thing in mind, which was why the laws are a little wonky in that regard. Sometimes, where like they're much more severe in those consequences because it is meant for the better of the collective, right? Whereas when you read through a lot of the narratives, it's much more individualistic, right? Um, which is where the Bible goes back and forth on like the community and then the individual, right? So, but of course, Cain is addressed as an individual, going back to the whole, first human being thing and all. So, yeah, that's the thing about Cain. Let's finish up here. God says, "Nope, you will not die." And then it goes about how Cain lived in the land of Nod. He gave birth to a son named Enoch, builds a city, and names the city after his son. And then, of course, it goes on like a little bit of Cain's genealogy. Now, the thing about Cain's genealogy, I don't have a lot to say about it. And actually, a lot of insight was given to me on this issue by Jordan Peterson, who actually explains the Cain's genealogy a lot better than I can do without plagiarism, anyways. But the only thing I will add on to it is basically Cain's genealogy is is where a lot of people get that implication that Cain started civilization, right, and started a society, if you will. Because when you look at his children, or his sons in particular, I guess, because it only, genealogy is only told through the men, right? So with Cain's sons and his grandsons and stuff like that, they're the ones who do all the civilization stuff, right? One is the inventor of music. One is the inventor of, iron, metal forging, basically, which is what you need. Metal forging is a central part of society, right? The arts, a central part of society. And so, descendant from, once again, more points in Cain's favor of being the first the first actual human being. Cain's family line starts civilization, which is interesting because, of course, aside from that, we don't really know much more about Cain's civilization, and hell, most of them probably die during the flood later on, right? And then, of course, the rest of the story is always told through, through Seth's genealogy, right? And Noah, who will be the next major character, and one of the few survivors of the big flood. He's from Seth's genealogy. Seth is Adam and Eve's third son, at least mentioned, anyways, because there's the implication that there may have been other kids in between Cain and Seth. Minus Abel, of course, because he's dead and all. But the interesting thing about Cain's genealogy is that it is from his genealogy we see civilization. And so, let's see, we have the guy who like lives in tents and raises livestock. So you got your nomad. You got the guy who played string instruments and pipes. So the arts guy, music guy, whatever. And then Tubal Cain, the guy who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. So civilization basically comes from Cain's family, right? Which is why a lot of people get that, it's implied that Cain started civilization. But, and I think that's where chapter 5 kind of, or sorry, chapter 4, kind of ends, right? And then the very last part is the new beginning, right? With Seth being born, and of course, then the Bible goes into like even more goes back into the more magical territory, which we'll talk about later next week, because this stream's been going for 2 hours and I only did one chapter in the Bible. But I mean, then again, the the Bible's one of those books, and you know the mythology aspect and the beauty of mythology within the Bible, if you will, is that it's a wellspring of, you know, interpretations and knowledge, right? Whereas like you don't just read it once and then it's like done, never have to read it again, right? There's so much that can be said. I could have said way more about the Cain and Abel story, but um, one, for time constraints, and two, I think one hot take is enough for you and for me. Um, one hot take is more than enough for a stream today. So, I mean, but once again, you can say so much more about the Cain and Abel story than you can about, you know, the creation story. I'll tell you that much. And in my opinion, the Cain and Abel story is way more interesting because of that. But I mean, I know there's a lot of people I disagree because a lot more people argue about the creation story than they talk about Cain and Abel. So maybe I'm wrong on that one, but I have opinions on that. So, but we'll leave that for another time. If you really want to know, maybe you can poke at me next stream or something like that. Which I'll try to do my next reading stream next Friday. Streaming schedule is going to be really messed up. Because I know I did like a Switch game stream when I first started this channel, and I haven't done that stream since, or that series since, because now that I'm working more hours in a week, because you know, due to most of the COVID stuff kind of blowing over, a lot of us have to go back to full-time work, um, like on the field, not just like working from home. I mean, as a security guard, you can't really work from home. That doesn't make any sense. But you know, I have to be on the field like 40 hours a week. So, um, with that being said, you know, when you're working 4 hours a week, it's pretty hard to um, maintain a streaming schedule, especially when it's shift work and you're kind of all over the place, right? So, um, we'll see. I'll try the next stream. I'll try and do, because starting Saturday, I actually work 5 days in a row, and I basically work 40 hours. So, I mean, one day I work like 2 less hours. I work 38 hours, but like, woo, right? Uh, 38 hours isn't a full week, but I'll be working 38 hours starting from Saturday. So that means like basically Wednesday night I'll be working. But of course, then you get into complications like overnight shifts, which I'm gonna not lie about it. I hate overnight, but most of that is probably because I'm old and I like sleeping at night as opposed to having to be awake and working. And sleeping in the day is not something I like doing. Um, I like to quote unquote sleep at night like a normal person, um, because I don't know, I'm like that. Of course, nowadays a lot more people are awake at night than they are during the day. But I mean, I guess the beauties of modern technology is, you know, the things like that don't matter that much anymore. But I personally dislike work. I dislike being up overnight. I like to be sleeping at night and do stuff during the day, like right now, right? So, um, with that being said, I will try to do my next stream next Thursday. So basically, the next stream I'm doing is Throwback Thursday, part 3. If you have not been caught up on that, you know, you just hop on my channel. All my streams are on there. That's one reason why I switched to YouTube. I used to do Twitch streaming, but in order to save your videos from Twitch, you have to like download it, and then half the time you have to put them on another platform anyway, because Twitch doesn't do like a whole video log, right? It only like your channel can only hold 14 videos, or sorry, 14 days of videos. Basically the last 2 weeks. The channel will hold that. You can save your videos, but then like unless you put those videos somewhere else that's easily accessible, how are people going to watch these things, right? And I think that's another reason. Um, I know some Christians might get on my case on this one, but like a lot of the stuff I'm doing here is just like me, a polished version of stuff I've already done on Twitch, but you can't find the stuff on Twitch because I did that like almost a year ago. So,
I'm kind of rehashing material, if you will. Oh, but you should be able to come up with a new sermon every week. Not gonna happen, buddy. Coming up with sermons every week ain't easy. Um, any full-time pastor can tell you that. That stuff ain't easy. There are times where, guilty confession, a lot of pastors do rehash material because it is a lot of work to come up with a new sermon every week. But where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so that's why I'm doing Genesis again, because I did it on Twitch a long time ago. But the reason why I was talking about this is because, hey, if you want to get caught up on the content, hey, just check out the YouTube channel that I have, where you're watching this. All the past live streams will be on. If you want to get caught up on Throwback Thursdays, you can do that, and you can also get caught up on these. As I do more weeks of this stuff, because I'm still pretty new at this, at least I'm new on this platform anyway. I won't put them into like their separate channels yet, but as the weeks pass by, probably around, I mean, definitely before 2021 gets here. But let's say if some weeks down the line, I'll probably put the streams into categories in their own playlists. So, for example, I'll put all the Throwback Thursdays together, and I'll put all the Bible reading ones together, etc. But I mean, this is like what, week 2, so I don't feel the need to do that right now. But with that being said, you can definitely check all my stuff on the channel if you need to get caught up. But anyway, with that being said, I'm going to call the stream here. And next time I will be on, I'll try and do it next Thursday, because it's going to be a little tight on the schedule, because basically I work 40 weeks starting tomorrow, and the last shift is an overnight Wednesday/Thursday morning, which is going to be rough on me. So we'll see if I do a Throwback Thursday. I want to do a Throwback Thursday, one, because I'm really enjoying playing StarCraft again. And it would basically be like almost a week since I last streamed, right? So I want to stream next Thursday, and so just follow. I'll leave comments on YouTube or whatever, on my YouTube channel to notify. But as far as this video is concerned, the word I'll say now is that next Thursday I'll try and do a Throwback Thursday. I may have to do it at a later hour than usual. Instead of doing it from like the afternoon, I'll probably do a night stream on Thursday for Throwback Thursday. That's probably what I'll end up doing. But with that being said, I'm gonna call the stream here. I hope you guys enjoyed this hot take on a Bible story everybody should know, because it's a hot take. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and yeah, I hope you guys have a good week. Stay safe, and God bless.